So thanks, Brad, and good morning, everybody. We're really excited to have you all here. So hopefully the clicker is working now. That would be key. Those are some beautiful pictures of us. And here's the agenda. So before we dive in, here's what we're going to talk about this morning. First, we'll do a brief overview of what is the Internet of Things. We'll talk about some issues specific to the Internet of Things and the regulatory response to those issues so far. And then finally, we'll talk through some common contracting challenges that you may be encountering with the Internet of Things and some legal and sourcing approaches to help you address those challenges. So first, what is the Internet of Things? There's no commonly accepted definition, but at its core, it's sensors and other network devices that are intended to monitor, report on, and react to information gathered in the physical world. So, this can be everything from consumer applications that you're already familiar with, Fitbits, Nest thermostats in your home, to commercial applications like RFID tags monitoring inventory. Generally, these devices are intended to give the user data that can be analyzed and used to lead to greater efficiencies, process improvements, and savings, most importantly sometimes. So within your companies, these devices could be monitoring manufacturing equipment for predictive maintenance purposes, or monitoring and optimizing lighting within your facilities, wide range of applications. So as you're probably not surprised, Internet of Things is growing rapidly. Some estimates forecast the number of connected devices are going to exceed 26 billion by 2025, and they'll have a multi-trillion-dollar impact on the global economy. So Boston Consulting Group has been doing some research about which B2B IoT use cases and industries are going to experience the most growth in the near future. And so what we see here on the chart are these bubbles represent spend on different IoT use cases, and the colors represent industries where that spend is going to occur in BCG's estimation. So there are a few trends to highlight here, and one is that a lot of the use cases are clustered around electric utilities, so that's the light green, and you can see there's a whole lot of that. And some of the use cases are smart meters, demand management, and distributed generation and storage. Then moving on, some of the other big industries that are experiencing or projected to experience large growth quickly, transportation and logistics, that's the slightly darker green. So you've got track and trace, fleet management, connected cars, connected vehicles. All of these are expected to mature very quickly, and that's what this bottom axis is. So how quickly are these things going to mature? The other big industry where they're forecasting a lot of growth are in utilities, discrete manufacturing. So things like predictive maintenance, self-optimizing production, and automated inventory management. So consistent with that chart we just looked at, BCG views growth happening very unevenly within the B2B IoT space. So the hottest growth is going to occur for companies that are in the services, analytics, and application space that are at the top of the IoT technology stack, as opposed to the dumb hardware devices that sit at the bottom of the IoT technology stack. Also, they estimate that half of IoT spending is going to occur in those three key industries: discrete manufacturing, transportation and logistics, and utilities. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca to talk about the regulatory response for B2B IoT.
Thanks, Joe. And good morning, everyone. I didn't expect you to be sitting so far in the back. In prior years, we've blocked off those rows. I have to remember that we need to do that again. But Joe and I very much want to welcome questions that you may have here in the room as we go along. So please, you're welcome to wait to the end if you'd like, but if you have a question to raise, please do so. And I want to welcome our audience who are following along on WebEx as well. Before we get started on the regulatory overview, you might be wondering, why are they focusing on B2B as opposed to all the other Internet of Things applications that we're all much more familiar with, like Fitbit and some of the other consumer-oriented ones? One of the reasons is we're finding that our clients are increasingly making use of IoT for business purposes. Sometimes it is in furtherance of connecting with their ultimate consumers or users of their products and services, but in some cases it's purely for behind-the-scenes cost savings and leveraging this technology. So we thought it was a little bit of an underexplored area. But if you are in a consumer-focused business, don't worry, because nearly everything that we're about to cover in this presentation is also applicable to consumer applications of Internet of Things. So very quickly on regulatory issues, we're going to do a brief overview of the state of play in the United States and talk a little bit about Europe. We'll hear a lot more about GDPR later on in our presentation from our Mark Prinsley, but we'll cover it today because it is still very much driving and relevant for Internet of Things. And we'll talk about personal data regulation, security concerns, and then some new potential sources of risk and liability that might come out of Internet of Things applications. Okay, so starting in the U.S., the regulatory overview is that there, as you all probably are well aware, there are no specific laws that regulate IoT specifically. There's been discussion of the need for laws in this area. There's been discussion of the need for the Department of IoT, but none of that has come about yet. And for the current moment, the regulation has been happening largely through the FTC with its oversight and concern under Section 5 and unfair and deceptive practices. And it's also coming out in certain sectors. For example, the FDA has put out recommendations for post-market management of cybersecurity and medical devices that has an Internet of Things component to it, and also NHTSA with its Federated Automated Vehicles Policy. By the way, if you're interested in the vehicle space, we have a fantastic practice group that has developed for autonomous vehicles and all things automated related to transportation. We have Linda Rhodes, who's one of the co-leaders of that group, and Margie Loeb in the room. So if you're interested in that topic, you might want to seek them out and tap into their knowledge about that. So back to the FTC. The FTC has been very active in regulating privacy as it relates to personal data and also some security issues. And with respect to IoT, that continues to be the focus, the protection of consumers and the protection of personal data that may be collected through IoT devices or solutions. In January of 2015, the FTC published a staff report, and the main focus of the guidance that they provided in this report was around three areas: protection of personal data, concerns about security, and concerns about personal safety through the use of IoT devices. So that's really going to continue to be the FTC's focus here. But they have done a couple of early enforcement actions that qualify in the IoT space, and we mentioned them here on this slide, a case or enforcement action against D-Link and another one against ASUS. In the case of D-Link, this is a Taiwan-based manufacturer of routers and IP cameras, and the FTC brought an enforcement action against them because part of what D-Link advertised is that their products are easy to secure and they contain advanced network security, when in fact these products had a couple of fatal security flaws that the FTC saw. They came with hard-coded login credentials. They were vulnerable to command injection attacks. There was mishandling of private key code information that's used to sign into the D-Link software. And there was failure to secure users' login credentials for D-Link's mobile app. Now, interestingly, in this case, there was no security violation that the FTC was aware of. There hadn't been a data breach. There might have been some complaints from consumers, but the FTC became aware of these security flaws and brought its enforcement action without a proven actual harm to consumers. So that's very significant in this case about how the FTC is willing to enforce even in the absence of a security incident. Not surprisingly, D-Link is contesting the FTC's authority to bring this enforcement action. D-Link is saying that there was no fair notice of what the security requirements should be, and that the FTC does not have authority to set internet security standards. There have been other similar challenges in this area about the FTC's authority. This one is particular to internet security standards. And lastly, D-Link said there was no actual consumer harm suffered. So, you know, no harm, no foul. What's the problem? The problems that occurred with ASUS were somewhat similar, and this involved both routers and the cloud service that ASUS was providing. And they had some similar problems with default login credentials, routers, web-based control panel, and changing settings, or somebody being able to hack in and do that without the user's knowledge or consent. So similar problems occurring in this area. So will we get a Department of IoT? Well, right now, the regulatory thought in the U.S. anyway is that the FTC, with its Section 5 authority and its ability to protect generally in commerce, not specifically to consumers. With that authority, the FTC is kind of taking a wait-and-see approach. And congressmen and women are also considering whether they need to do anything, but of course there are concerns about stalling innovation, stymieing data uses, which is becoming a very important tool. We'll hear about that in our next segment. And just general concerns that if we regulate too early in this area, we may lock people into technology approaches that become inflexible. So for right now in the U.S., there's very much a wait-and-see approach in regulation in this area. Moving over to Europe for a moment, though the EU has also not adopted specific IoT regulations, in Europe, they are also relying on the Data Protection Directive that exists, that's soon to be replaced with the General Data Protection Regulation in May of next year. And some provisions of the e-Privacy Directive would also apply to IoT applications and use in this space. I also want to note, as you go around the rest of the world, we're seeing the same thing. Places like Canada and Australia that have existing data protection regulations in place currently are relying on those protections for regulating in the IoT space. And around the world, as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, we have some developing data protection laws that are going to make IoT and general uses of the cloud more challenging. So China and Russia, for example, having data localization laws is going to make the collection of information through IoT uses and frankly through any technology use much more challenging and difficult because the data will have to stay located in those countries. Out of Europe, there has been some guidance put out by the Article 29 Working Party, which is a collection of data protection authorities in Europe who get together and put out guidance or opinions on various topics. And they have put out some guidance on Internet of Things. And essentially what they're saying is they believe that with their current regulatory framework that individual rights and personal data rights are sufficiently protected with what they have, although they are very much going to take a wait-and-see approach to see if they feel the need to enact any additional regulations in the future. Okay, so now we're going to take just a little deeper dive with that overview into regulatory issues and concerns and challenges in adopting and using IoT. So in a business and commercial setting, you may end up gathering personal data, even through your business applications of Internet of Things. And this can trigger privacy and regulatory concerns when that happens. And this is even more true in Europe because Europe takes a very, very broad view of what personal data is. In the United States, we either have laws or we've got a number of state data breach laws that define personal information as some identifying piece of information, usually coupled with something else, like an account number or an identifier or an email address, something that would allow you to get access. Our laws, for the most part, have been centered around protection against identity theft and protection of the individual around that. We have HIPAA, of course, which protects health information, and we have GLB, which protects non-public financial information. But by and large, many of the other laws that exist, particularly coming from the states, have that motivation in mind. But in Europe, the definition of personal data is much broader, and it definitely includes data that is collected in a business context. And so if you are a company that collects information on your suppliers and you have to have the name of an individual who you work with at that company, that information, that individual's email address is in fact personal data under European regulations. So you can see how even when you think you're doing a pure business-to-business application, if there is still incidental collection of personal information, these regulations around personal data are going to apply to your IoT solutions. And smart devices, even when they are used in a non-consumer setting and a pure business-to-business application, and we'll talk about some of those in some coming slides, they can still very much leave a digital footprint that can be traced or somehow attached to an individual. Now, I mentioned that the FTC is involved in regulating personal data because their authority covers unfair, deceptive acts and practices in or affecting commerce. They have chosen for the moment to mostly rely on consumer protection, but for businesses who aren't dealing directly with consumers, you still need to worry about your employee data. And so if you are using IoT and there's a collection of employee data, direct or incidental, the FTC also has the authority and the jurisdiction to regulate that. And finally, one of the challenges, which I think Joe might talk about later on his slides, is the FTC has recommended fair information practice principles. And among them, and quite strongly held, is notice and choice principle, that if you're going to be collecting data about somebody, they ought to have notice and they ought to have a choice about whether that collection should happen. When you think about Internet of Things and smart devices, many times there isn't going to be a ready, handy vehicle for presenting a notice to an individual and putting them on notice that there may be personal data collected here, either directly or incidentally. And again, if you don't deal in the consumer world and you have employee data that's being gathered this way, you will need to think about how am I going to put my employees on notice and let them know that this data is being collected and obtain their consent if you want to be following these fair information practices and principles. So let's talk about an example of that. If you have an operator operating machinery that's been enabled with sensors and it's sending data that's being collected, maybe it's a mining operation, for example, and you're collecting geolocation information, you're collecting information about the mining operations that are happening. There might be sensitive data coordinates being sent to the equipment to help the operator locate the correct place to do the mining. All of that data is being collected, leaving the machine. Chances are the operator of that machinery has had to sign in under some type of employment identification number. And so in the process of simply doing his or her job, there's data being collected, and that can result in a number of questions coming up. If the equipment is sitting idle, is the person, are they off on frolic and detour, or is she doing her job, operating the equipment at the times that she's supposed to be working? What do the geolocation data indicate about where a person is? Are they where they're supposed to be at that particular time of day, or again, have they gone off doing something they shouldn't be doing? And what if the sensors on the equipment just relate not necessarily to where someone is, but have they done their job properly? If we sensor enable various maintenance functions, for example, and a sensor indicates that somebody who was supposed to go in and perform maintenance did not do it correctly, what does that say about the performance of the employee and the individual who's doing that work? So I think if you think about some of these use cases, you can begin to see how this incidental collection of employee data can become a personal data issue. And then finally, on the personal data concerns, we have states that have their own laws about monitoring, tracking, and collecting information on employees. And so, for example, Minnesota has laws like this. In Connecticut, employers are prohibited from using electronic surveillance without express employee consent. And if you're handing out mobile devices to people to use to enable them to get their work done, what is going to be the right way for you to get their consent? Is it a device in which you're able to present a consent right there so that before they power up the device and start using it, they're able to consent to it? Is it something that you can accomplish through their employment papers? Is that close enough to the use of the equipment to qualify as a good informed consent? These are all questions that we're going to have to figure out about collection of employee data in an IoT setting. And lastly, if you run wellness programs, you might be issuing Fitbits, or you might be doing things to encourage people to make themselves healthier, and in the process collecting information that could subject you to HIPAA or to other EEOC requirements. We had one client in particular who wanted to encourage its employees to use the gym, so it set up a kind of a Fitbit scenario where you would go in and you would log into the gym, and that data would be collected by the employer and by the insurance company, and you would essentially receive good health credits for the number of times that you logged into the gym. Now, no one was there to make sure that you did anything. You could have gone to the gym and had a, banana split or something, but
that's my technique.
The fact remains that, there are uses like that that can bring these IoT concerns around personal data into effect. So I think with all that background, we've established that even if you are in a business setting, operating business IoT solution, there may be collection of personal data either from your users or from your employees, and you're going to have to follow these personal data protection laws and regulations, as well as be concerned about the security around your application so that that data does not become compromised. Finally, on Europe, just to beat up on them a little more because I like to do that, as Mark Prinsley knows. So Europe, in its wisdom, has a new harmonized law that will take effect in May 2018, and it's got a lot of new goodies in it, but many of them will impact much of the technology that we're going to talk about today, and in the IoT context, these issues will definitely have to be taken into account. So we've got some new requirements around privacy by design. Now, this is privacy by design, security by design are principles that have been out there for a while, but now they are becoming part of the regulation. And so as you design an IoT solution, or as you acquire the pieces and parts from different suppliers who are designing those pieces and parts for you, you are going to have to think about privacy by design, and you may have to talk to your suppliers about what have they done about privacy by design. And what that means is that the solution has been designed to take into account all the various parts of the regulation that you have to comply with, and that tends to be around the individual's rights. So individuals under the current directive and also under the new regulation have rights to have access to their data. They have rights to correct the data and check it for accuracy. They have a new right to be forgotten in some circumstances where the data that you have on them may have to be deleted. So all of these things are supposed to be taken into account as the hardware and the software and the cloud services and the network connectivity and all the other pieces that make up an IoT solution are designed. The other thing that you might need to think about is a data protection impact assessment, a DPIA. This is something that if there is certain levels of activity going on, profiling being one of the ones that Europe is very concerned about, you might have to do an impact assessment before you can even roll out your IoT solution. And an impact assessment is really an assessment of the key risks that are generated for individuals or the compliance risks that you might have in using this particular solution. And then it talks about how have you mitigated those risks or how have you attempted to do that. I'm sure Mark will talk more today about DPIAs, but again, they have a very broad impact for literally all of the technology scenarios that we're going to talk about today. So the practical tip that I leave you with in this whole series that we just discussed is if you are going to use an IoT solution and you're either going to directly or indirectly capture either user data or employee data, then you really need to consult with your privacy counsel, and if you have European operations involved here, you'll be collecting European personal information. You need to consult with European privacy lawyers as well. Joe, back to you.
Okay. So next IoT issue, security concerns. So many of these IoT device manufacturers don't come from the world of software, and cybersecurity may not be their strong suit. They may be more interested in emphasizing additional features like battery life, appearance of their devices over things like security. So, you know, another thing to keep in mind is that we're dealing with standardized IoT devices. So if they've compromised the security on one of your IoT devices, they've compromised on all of them. Next, physical access. This is a big point. The whole rationale for IoT is that it's out there in the physical world measuring and gathering information and data. And that means that it's probably not going to be locked down in your secure data center with a bunch of physical security measures. So whether that means these are IoT devices spread throughout your facilities or, let's say, on telephone poles or just out there in the world, you've increased the number of access points to your network and areas that hackers can get into. So along with that, obviously, all these devices are networked to relay data back to you. So all of these are multiplying points of network and security risks that you need to take into account as you're considering any IoT deployment. So what's a real-world example of these types of IoT risks? In October 2016, hackers used infected IoT devices. I think most of them were actually webcams to launch a worldwide DDoS attack on a DNS provider. And this ended up crippling a number of websites. Netflix, Twitter, a bunch of different sites went down. I remember I couldn't check Twitter on my lunch break. It was pretty frustrating. So, you know, these kinds of attacks are already happening. These are all real-world issues. Another example, what if a hacker gets access to the smart thermostats in your data center and starts increasing the temperature to a level that could start impacting your servers and your storage devices? I stole that example from the TV show Mr. Robot, but I think it's a pretty good one. So another example, not from the USA Network, VTech, an educational toy manufacturer. So they offer these products that are web-enabled toys for children, and they gather personal data on parents and children, and they represented to all their customers that we'll keep your data private and secure. Unfortunately, in 2015, hackers were able to steal information on 2.8 million of these individuals through the VTech products. So this has led to a whole variety of class action lawsuits against VTech. Things for, you know, there's a breach of contract, breach of good faith and fair dealing, implied warranty, negligence, et cetera. So this is just one example of the types of liability you could face for security issues from using IoT. And security researchers have demonstrated a whole variety of other examples where IoT devices can be compromised. Connected cars, connected vehicles. I'm sure you guys saw the news reports about, I don't know, a year and a half ago that a major car manufacturer had discovered a vulnerability that would allow hackers to hack into your connected vehicle. Thermostats, implanted medical devices, extremely scary. Somebody hacks into somebody's pacemaker that's web-enabled. Voting machines and power plants, those have both been in the news. Smart light bulbs. Somebody hacks into smart light bulbs. Could they turn off light bulbs throughout your city? Your smart city. These are all the downside risks to all the cool things the Internet of Things can do for you. Next IoT issue, data use and ownership. So drawing the lines of data ownership for IoT is very tricky and very necessary. So imagine that you have smart devices running in your manufacturing equipment, for example. Does the OEM of the equipment own the raw data that describes the performance of the product? That seems logical as a starting place for warranty, safety, other purposes. But what about the derived data about how your users are configuring those machines to run at maximum capacity before creating a maintenance issue? Can the OEM have a license in that data and use it to sell aggregated industry reports or even sell tips to other customers who might be your competitors on how to best configure and use their products to achieve better results? You might have a bigger problem with that. And not even just the device manufacturers. This could be an IoT supplier issue. It could be an issue with your SaaS supplier that's integrated with your IoT devices, your analytics provider. If they're analyzing your data from your smart devices and they're discovering valuable trends, patterns, correlations, et cetera, who's going to own that analysis? Is the provider going to capture all of that, or is the customer? These are things to start thinking through. And the default supplier response to this, which I'm sure everybody in the room has heard, was, well, we'll anonymize your data, we'll aggregate it with all of our other customers, and then, you know, we have the right to use it to improve our products and services. This is good for everybody. The problem is that you can re-identify anonymized data by comparing other available data sets. So I'm sure almost everybody in the room has heard the anecdote that 87% of Americans' anonymous data can be re-identified with 3 pieces of data: birthday, gender, zip code. So that's 320 million Americans. That's a big data set. So now step back and think, you know, if they're comparing data sets for just companies that are within your industry and have your company's profile, how easy is it going to be for somebody to re-identify your company from those much smaller data sets? So within this context, you should consider whether you're actually comfortable or not with these rights to use anonymized aggregated data. Final point on data: what happens at the end of the term when you want to get your data back from the supplier? That data isn't going to be valuable to you unless it's in a format that you can use it, not in the supplier's proprietary format. So in your contracts, make sure you add some type of right to get your data back in an industry standard format or other format that you reasonably request from time to time or upon termination. So real world example of data use and ownership issues. So farmers are starting to use drones to monitor their farms. I think actually we had somebody talk about that in an earlier conference. And one of the vendors in this space is a company called Precision Hawk. So they sell the actual drone hardware, they sell you the software, they sell the training services. And clearly a lot of Precision Hawk customers are going to be competitors with one another in the farming space, specifically the large-scale feed industry. So consistent with the prior slide, the American Farm Bureau Federation actually recommends to farmers that they need to negotiate the data rights before they enter into contracts with these suppliers. So this isn't specific to Precision Hawk, but if you just think through you know, how this could play out, the data gathered by a drone vendor could be analyzed to reveal which farmers are using the best techniques, who's doing the best water management, dealing with pesticide, fertilizers, et cetera, in a way that's maximizing production. So if your drone vendor is distilling down that data and analyzing who's got the best run farm, and then they're selling tips to other farmers on how they can maximize their production, that could be a big point of concern for you. You've just lost a competitive advantage. Next IoT issue, potentially increased liability and regulatory concerns. So since IoT devices are out there in the physical world and they're interacting with and responding to things out there, that means when something goes wrong, it could create harms to persons or property. So example, let's say you have smart floor cleaning machines that are on your factory floor, your retail store, whatever it may be. And if those machines have malfunctioned or they're hacked by a malicious hacker, and they're reprogrammed to wash the floors at a high traffic time of day when it's not expected, you could find yourself with increased risks of personal injury claims, for example. Second, your IoT devices are probably gathering enormous amounts of data. So when a discovery request comes in, that means you have to preserve more data on your systems, and you have to search through more data for relevant records. More data, more discovery cost. So that's just something to bear in mind. Also, you've increased the amount of data that's now available to plaintiffs to prove their claims against you. So that's one more thing to think about. Also, you may have increased liability for product defects or safety problems. One of the tests for you know, whether you can recover for liability is whether the harm was foreseeable. So another example, let's say that a grocery store installs smart refrigerators, smart freezers, and they relay temperature data back to the user wherever they may be. So let's say that you know, grocery store X installs these throughout their locations nationwide, but step 2 is actually figuring out what to do with that data. So everything's installed, but nobody's paying attention to the data. Now, if a customer gets sick because they drank spoiled milk that came out of one of the refrigerators, and if the company had just looked at the temperature data and seen that temperature was spiking to an unsafe level for the food products, you may have a problem on your hands if a plaintiff can see that and say, wow, they should have been paying attention to this data and reacting to it. Now my client has gotten sick. Related point, if regulators know you're collecting these vast amounts of data, they're probably going to want to see it at some time. Let's say you've got smart forklifts that might show how safe or unsafe your distribution center is. A regulator is probably going to ask to see that at some point, and you want to make sure that you're looking at it before your regulator is looking at it or a plaintiff's attorney is looking at it, so you can react to it before they do.
Sorry, one way to think about this is all of this data is kind of expanding the range of what's foreseeable for businesses, right? Right now, the way you operate your business, you have an idea of what's foreseeable and what isn't, but the more and more data that you collect and the more insights that it shares with you, the more you may be held responsible for foreseeing a broader range of harms that could occur. Okay, so now now that we've talked about some of the key risks and the regulatory oversight, we're going to talk a little bit about, as attorneys who are working with businesses who might be adopting IoT solutions, particularly in a B2B space, what are some of the contracting tips that we have, or some of the key areas that you'll want to pay attention to as you are integrating, helping your business to integrate these solutions. So this picture is kind of a procurement person's nightmare and maybe an outside attorney's dream. If you look at all the places, starting with the data collection in the equipment, and though these might be hard to tell what they are, of course, we've got heavy equipment of any type. We've got lighting systems similar to those that we talked about. This could be in a retail store. This could be in a factory. This is meant to be a turbine engine collecting data, and that can be in any application. There are many others. I heard this morning that Delta is going to start using biometric data in connection with baggage drop-off and claim. They're testing that right now. So that's kind of a business/end user IoT solution. So you can see all the different connection points, and what S1 through S4 represent are different suppliers that the company that wants to put this solution together is likely going to have to contract with. This is a relatively immature area, and there are not a lot of end-to-end solutions out there yet. There are some, but with our clients, many of them are having to piece this together, and we'll talk about some of the contracting issues that presents and some of the main things that you'll need to think about in helping your clients through these contracts. So obviously there's a lot of complexity. The hardware has to work with the software, which has to work with whatever platform software and operating applications are in the cloud, and then it has to potentially go to yet another vendor for doing some analytics, and all of that results in output and data to the end user customer or business. So very quickly, given our time, how do you get ready to contract in this area? Well, not surprisingly, it's the same steps that you would go through to handle any new technology solutions that are coming along. But this is kind of a time-tested, proven map of steps that we use to get clients ready and help them be better prepared to contract in this area, rather than always just being in a reactive mode. So you want to develop your contracting policies, understand where your key risks are, and understand how you might want to mitigate those in your contract. You want to understand where are the hidden costs. If you think about the data requests that you may get that Joe talked about, how are you going to get data off devices if that becomes an issue? Because in many cases, there's a lot of data that doesn't go up to a cloud, it stays on the device itself, and yet that might be something that you are legally required to produce or provide information about. And that's an example of a hidden cost that you need to think about in an IoT solution. You want to try to avoid one-sided supplier forms and negotiate off of your own templates if possible, and if not, then understand where you need to modify the form to make it work for you and your business and the risks that you want to take on. Try to invest in templates, because even if you don't use them, this helps you to understand what are your primary provisions that you want to get, and they're a ready-made place that you can steal language from and insert into a supplier's form if you need to. And appoint individuals who will serve as the contact with the supplier. Now, in this case, if we back up for a moment to our picture, you know, this may require this company to have people who understand each individual supplier solution, and all of them have to work together. That might not be possible for one person to have all that knowledge of how the solution works, you know, what's the change schedule, what's in the roadmap for changes that are coming down the road. So you'll need to think about having the right team to maintain this solution over time.
So, you know, what are some other contracting challenges with these IoT vendors? In many cases, the software and firmware in these IoT devices is open source. So if your company's proprietary software becomes integrated with the open source software, your software can become subject to those open source licenses. So depending on the open source license, that could obligate you to make your proprietary software publicly available to the open source community. So as part of diligence for any IoT devices you're thinking about procuring, you'll want to understand what licenses are being used. And sometimes identifying the licenses can be a real challenge here because there's a complex supply chain for these IoT devices. You'll also want a commitment from the supplier that the devices either are not or will not become subject to further open source licenses during the term of the agreement. And just a public service announcement, our colleagues Paul Chandler and Rich Asmus will be covering these topics in a lot further detail later. Next, as is contract terms. Like cloud vendors, IoT vendors are trying to sign you up for one-sided click-wrap terms that are subject to unilateral change by the supplier. So like Rebecca said, try and push for your own paper that opts out of those click-through terms. Next issue, interoperability. Can you interface the supplier's devices with your preferred products and services? So sometimes suppliers will limit operability to products within their walled garden or proprietary ecosystem of compatible products. So you need to make sure that you'll have sufficient flexibility to integrate any IoT devices that you buy with other software and devices you've selected. So these are all things to think about during the sourcing process if possible. Technology currency challenges. So sometimes it can be difficult to update these IoT devices after they've left the supplier's factory. Most of the time these devices are pretty simple, designed for maximum battery life, for example, and they aren't running sophisticated operating systems like a smartphone where you can just apply patches and updates all the time. So this can pose serious integration problems that Rebecca's going to get into in the next slide. You know, so for example, if the SAS integrated with your smart lighting systems may change, and if you can't install and update your smart lighting systems to make the SAS integrate properly, you're no longer pulling data from your smart lighting systems, and you've undermined the entire rationale for your IoT deployment. So with that as background, it's important to allocate responsibility for these maintenance and updates in your contract. Related point, end-of-life issues. Are you going to complete expensive 2-year IoT rollout and find out that the supplier is about to take your product off of maintenance, off of support, or they're going to remove support or remove features that were part of the basis for you going with that supplier? So at a minimum, consider obtaining commitments from the supplier to lengthy notice periods before they take any product off of support or before they deprecate any of their features. Integration challenges?
Yes, okay. So we really already talked about this on the picture slide, but if you think about that as we go through some of these challenges, again, few end-to-end solutions exist. So you're either going to need to patch it together with various suppliers, or you might consider hiring a service integrator. We're seeing this function come up with companies like Accenture and others who are willing to come in and kind of manage the end-to-end process for you. Oftentimes it's because customers don't feel that they have the skill set to be able to do that. Maybe they don't have the relationships with the suppliers that some of the service integrators do. But that's a new role that we're seeing kind of rise up out of some of these digital mesh connected web solutions that we're seeing. Change management obviously is going to be a key area to focus on. Now, that's part law and part tech and security teams who have to get down into the weeds and understand, you know, how am I going to be notified? When is this product going to change? When are they going to issue new versions? How will I be made aware of that? Do I have to go monitor websites to find out about it? Will I be able to get access to the roadmap so that I've got a slightly longer view to what changes might be coming down the road, so that I can then think in that chain, thinking back to our picture, you know, all that chain of interconnectedness that needs to work together. How are you going to do that? And you want to think about putting some of these things into the contract to the extent that you're able to do so with the supplier. So maybe you can sit on an advisory board and get access to the roadmap. Maybe you're able to work in a provision that says you'll get no less than 90 days notice of a change that's coming down the road, so that you can think about your integration points and the domino effect that a change may have. You might have to get creative, particularly with some of these low-cost providers that offer a very standardized solution, and you might end up having to take some risk on associated with that, because in many cases they cannot and will not vary their platform for you. You might be able to get more in the contract that describes what they do as a provider, but you will not be able to change the way that they provide the service, at least not without you having to go to some kind of bespoke you know, customized, made for you type of application, which is then going to cost you more money. Incident response is a particularly challenging area here as well. And again, something for your tech team and your incident management people to think about. So if there is an outage and you think back to that diagram with all the different connection points, how are you going to figure out what's the cause of the problem? Is it a problem with the software that's in the cloud? Is it a problem with connectivity getting into the cloud? Is it a problem with the device? You've got to think about that, and you've got to broaden your incident management and response plan, and particularly your data breach response plans, to take into account what are these vendors' areas of responsibility, and how am I going to work with them if there is a breach and I need to understand where the problem has occurred. How do I get the service back up and running? It may fall on the customer to determine that information, and that's the case where Joe's going to talk about how good governance is going to be very important. But you need to understand how much responsibility you as the customer are going to need to retain, and how much management you may have to put into working with these different suppliers who make up the piece parts of your IoT solution. So Joe, you want to talk about governance?
Sure. So unlike traditional service relationships you might be used to, IoT suppliers are unlikely to offer you some type of robust governance team. It's not part of the low price model for these types of providers. They're trying to eliminate people, not staff them on your deals. So the robotically automated processes they're going to be offering you aren't going to be producing root cause analysis like your counterpart on a governance committee, and generally aren't going to be as user friendly. So how do you handle governance problems when your governance contact is a hyperlink at the supplier's website? Basically, the punchline is the customer or an integrator that the customer has hired is going to have to manage governance in a hands-on way to make sure everything's working. So these suppliers are giving you innovative products and services. One of the trade-offs for that is that customer is the only party making sure that all these pieces and parts are fitting together and working as intended. So as Rebecca mentioned, you're going to need to have dedicated people from a governance perspective who understand these relationships, who are paying attention to changes, et cetera. Another thing to consider is investing in specialists who have relationships or prior experience with these suppliers who can help you navigate issues that they've seen for similar companies in the past. Next, implement master terms if possible with your IoT suppliers, just to simplify governance with them going forward. Some of the newer suppliers aren't going to be comfortable with this, but you should try to obtain a master agreement on your paper if possible, as we've mentioned a few times. Finally, designate somebody to build a relationship with an actual human being at the supplier. That could be through sales channels, user groups, roadmap discussions like Rebecca mentioned, but the key is to have a name and a phone number for an actual person you can call and not some automated support inbox. just having a person that you can call and that you know can be invaluable when you're trying to understand a change, get information, solve a problem, et cetera. So that sounds simple and straightforward, and why didn't I think of that, but it's something to think about. Rebecca?
Yep. So I think we have just a couple of minutes left, and to quickly summarize, there's a lot of opportunity in this area. You'll want to watch the regulatory developments to make sure that you stay on top of that. Thus far, they're primarily in the personal data and security area, but you'll want to keep a broader eye to what else might be developing out there. Contracting in this space does present some very different risks and issues from some of the more traditional contracting that we all in this room might have been exposed to. So you need to think about some of those key differences that we've discussed here today. And as with any new disruptive technology, there are ways to be prepared. That's on the contracting slide that we went over about developing your policies, developing your fallback positions, developing your templates. And so with that, I think we have a minute or two for any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
What's the law on developing compromises of Internet of Things devices that serve as a control and command center, source of an attack?
Could we ask you to tell our listeners?
Is there any law developing on Internet of Things compromises where the device is a control and command center or a source of a subsequent attack on a larger company? How does liability get shifted between those two entities?
You've identified a clear hole in the regulatory regime, and a lot of the materials that Rebecca and I read leading up to this, researchers will say, okay, the users of these IoT devices, the guy who has the webcam, he doesn't care about changing his default password. He doesn't care if it's used in a DDoS attack that cripples everything. The webcam's working fine from his perspective, so he doesn't care. And then the manufacturer, they may have FTC liability, but it's difficult to figure out who's got skin in the game and who's on the hook when one of these attacks happen.
At this point, unless you're dealing in the government space, so let's leave that aside for the moment, it's largely by contract. And so the allocation of risk and the allocation of liability, particularly between businesses, is going to come down to what's in your contract. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.